Welcome back to another deep dive on TT Stories, where we unravel the moments when ordinary people are pushed to the absolute brink, forced to either surrender to the crushing weight of neighborhood tyranny or burn the entire corrupt system to the ground. The woman stood at the edge of my sun-baked driveway just as the harsh Las Vegas dawn was beginning to bleed over the horizon, her manicured fingers gripping a clipboard like it was a royal scepter, gleefully pressing a bright orange $500 violation notice directly into the freshly painted wood of my garage door with industrial-strength adhesive. I am Elias, a man who had barely managed to swallow his first bitter sip of black coffee, stepping out into the suffocating dry heat of the Mojave morning only to find that peeling away her vindictive little sticker was tearing chunks of white paint right off my property, all for the supposed crime of storing 12 vintage racing tires that had belonged to my late father. And there she was, Eleanor Vance, the undisputed, self-anointed supreme ruler of Cypress Point Reserve, power-walking past my property in pristine, blindingly white tennis gear that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, throwing a fleeting, venomous smirk over her shoulder as if my mere existence was a stain on her meticulously curated suburban utopia. Those 12 rings of cracked, beautifully aged rubber were not garbage to me. They were a tangible connection to a man who had spent his life with grease permanently stained into his knuckles at Great Basin Auto and Rubber, representing not just my heritage, but a documented $15,000 in collector's value. Yet this woman had decided that my quiet, unassuming life was a cancerous threat to her empire. The air smelled of hot dust and impending conflict, a scent that dragged me back through the darkest years of my life. A journey that started when I moved away from a peaceful existence in Reno, surviving on a hard-earned military pension after 3 decades of maintaining and diagnosing the infinitely complex hydraulic systems of Navy fighter jets, only to watch my beautiful wife Clara wither away from an aggressive illness that stole her in less than a year. The grief had barely begun to hollow me out when my mother's mind started to slip, forcing me to relocate to this suffocatingly artificial neighborhood in southern Nevada, a place where the median home value hovered around an inflated $500,000, while my modest property sat as a glaring, unacceptable outlier in Eleanor's eyes. This sprawling labyrinth of identical stucco homes was populated mostly by exhausted young families drowning in debt and retirees desperate to wield whatever microscopic slivers of authority they could grasp. And at the absolute pinnacle of this hierarchy sat Eleanor, a 50-something real estate agent whose aggressively blonde hair never moved in the desert wind, gliding through our streets in a perpetually spotless silver Lexus, weaponizing a homeowners association presidency she had secured, with barely 30 votes from apathetic neighbors who simply wanted to be left alone. She ruled through terror and the subjective interpretation of community excellence, which really meant a systematic, surgical eradication of anyone who exhibited a hint of blue-collar reality, a discrimination she practiced with terrifying precision. I had watched her hit Mateo Flores, an incredibly hard-working young father, with an immediate $300 fine simply for parking his livelihood, a modest landscaping truck, in his own driveway for a few hours, while her closest confidant and literal partner in crime, a woman named Brenda, kept a massive, hulking recreational vehicle parked on her side lawn for the better part of a year without receiving so much as a polite warning. It didn't stop there, as I remembered the heartbreak of an 80-year-old widow named Martha Higgins, who was mercilessly cited $200 for placing a handful of small, painted ceramic birds in her flower bed that her late husband had bought for her on their final anniversary, all while another board member's property looked like a neglected maritime salvage yard completely untouched by HOA enforcement because he happened to drive a luxury European sedan. Staring at the shredded paint on my garage door, holding a fine that threatened daily compounding interest and the eventual placement of a lien on my home, my eyes caught a handwritten note scrawled at the bottom of the citation in looping, arrogant cursive, suggesting that perhaps I would feel more comfortable relocating to a neighborhood that was less selective. That was the exact moment the profound, suffocating sorrow that had weighed on my chest since Clara's funeral crystallized into something entirely different, a cold, mechanical clarity washing over my nervous system, the exact same razor-sharp focus I used to rely on when diagnosing catastrophic structural failures on multi-million-dollar military aircraft. I realized in that frozen second that bullies who have never faced genuine resistance become complacent, relying on fear and the assumption that their targets will simply pay the extortion to avoid conflict, utterly unaware that every rigid system has a weak point, every corrupt organization has a paper trail, and every tyrant eventually makes the fatal miscalculation of trying to crush someone who actually knows how to systematically dismantle an infrastructure piece by piece. When I calmly walked into the sterile, echoing clubhouse for my appeal hearing a few days later, carrying a perfectly organized binder of professional appraisals, historical documentation, and proof of immaculate storage conditions, I was met by the icy, condescending stare of Eleanor and her terrified lapdog of a board member, Arthur, who looked like a man perpetually bracing for a physical blow. Before I could even finish presenting the evidence that my father's legacy held more monetary value than her entire seasonal wardrobe, she cut me off, her cloying floral perfume masking the rot of her unchecked ego, stating flatly that my sentimental delusions had no bearing on their architectural standards, swiftly slamming down the gavel to uphold the fine, while slapping an additional $50 penalty on my account for daring to waste their time with a frivolous dispute. I didn't yell, I didn't pound my fists on the mahogany table. I simply smiled a terrifyingly polite smile, thanked them for their absolute clarity on the matter, and walked out into the blinding Nevada sun, officially initiating a war that she could never possibly comprehend. I spent the next week utilizing decades of military-grade investigative discipline to map out the hypocrisy of Cypress Point Reserve, documenting every single overlooked violation belonging to Eleanor's inner circle, photographing Brenda's rusting RV, and noting the blatant, undeniable pattern of targeted financial harassment against minorities and working-class residents. But my analytical mind kept snagging on the arbitrary administrative fees the board kept inventing out of thin air. Knowing that the state of Nevada possesses incredibly strict housing statutes regarding uniform enforcement and discrimination, I quietly submitted a meticulously categorized dossier to the Nevada Real Estate Division, not because I expected a bureaucratic agency to swoop in and save me overnight, but because I needed the irrefutable bedrock of a federal paper trail before I detonated the bomb I was currently building. Whispers of my quiet defiance began to ripple through the identical streets, leading the elderly Martha to practically sneak over to my porch one evening, her frail hands trembling as she casually mentioned a supposed community revitalization fund that the board had been siphoning money into for years, a fund that had mysteriously drained tens of thousands of dollars without a single new tree or painted curb to show for it. That whisper was the key to the kingdom, prompting me to immediately leverage public records requests, a beautifully unfeeling mechanism of the law, which within days yielded a stack of financial disclosures revealing that the so-called revitalization fund was essentially a private pipeline funneling exorbitant amounts of community money directly into a company called Vance Terra Corp., a landscaping business wholly owned by Richard Vance, who just so happened to share a bed with our tyrannical HOA president. I didn't march to her house and demand answers. I bypassed her entirely, quietly printing out a simplified, devastatingly clear breakdown of how the neighborhood's hard-earned association dues were financing the Vance family's luxury vacations, slipping these undeniable truths into the mailbox of every single resident under the cover of darkness, ensuring that when the sun rose over the desert, the illusion of her supremacy would be irrevocably shattered. The morning after my nocturnal document distribution, my phone practically vibrated off the kitchen counter as deeply outraged neighbors, people who had spent years silently enduring exorbitant fees and petty fines, realized they had been systematically robbed by a woman who preached community excellence while skimming off the top, flooding my inbox with pledges of support and a sudden, desperate thirst for a class-action lawsuit. Eleanor, however, operated with the blind arrogance of a dictator who believes her own propaganda, responding to the unrest not with humility, but by sending a terrifying, legally dense notice from her personal law firm, a certified letter threatening aggressive foreclosure proceedings on my home if I did not immediately surrender nearly $1,000 in escalating fines and remove the tires, a nuclear threat designed to break the spirit of a grieving widower. What she failed to realize was that I had spent the preceding 72 hours completely immersed in the dusty, neglected archives of the very foundation she claimed to protect, poring over the original 1992 founding covenants of Cypress Point Reserve, bypassing the modern, heavily altered rules she had illegally fabricated to find the foundational bedrock of the community. Hidden deep within the archaic, typewritten pages of Section 15, I found a glorious, sweeping paragraph explicitly encouraging homeowners to utilize creative, freestanding botanical planters to elevate the aesthetic harmony of the desert environment, a clause that mandated encouragement rather than restriction, legally insulating any resident who chose to embrace horticultural expression. I didn't haul my father's legacy to the dump. I drove straight to Mojave Sun Botanicals as the gates opened, finding a kindred spirit in the fiercely independent owner, Sophia, who took one look at my battle-weary eyes and laughed with pure, chaotic joy when I explained my plan to legally weaponize 12 vintage racing tires against a corrupt suburban regime. Together, we selected the most resilient, visually explosive flora the desert had to offer, loading my truck with vibrant Mojave asters, deep green agave pups, and cascading waves of trailing indigo, species engineered by nature to thrive in the punishing heat, while looking like a brilliant, defiant explosion of life against the cracked black canvas of the rubber treads. By the time the brutal afternoon sun reached its peak, my driveway had been transformed into a jaw-dropping, immaculately curated botanical gallery, the tires meticulously arranged and bursting with color, completely fundamentally protected by the exact legal document Eleanor used to bludgeon her victims, turning an alleged eyesore into the most vibrant, life-affirming property on the entire block. The psychological warfare was immediate and devastating, as neighbors who had previously kept their heads down began pausing on their evening walks, their faces lighting up with genuine awe, while Martha Higgins bravely shuffled across the asphalt with her own watering can, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of insurgency as she offered to help me tend to the very rebellion that was making our tormentor lose her grip on reality. Within days, this solitary act of defiance mutated into a community-wide movement, with Mateo Flores arriving after his landscaping shifts to install a completely invisible, professional-grade drip irrigation system free of charge, and a brilliant, quiet teenager from down the street, named Leo, volunteering his afternoons to wire elegant, solar-powered accent lights that made the rubber planters glow with a surreal, ethereal beauty long after the sun went down. Eleanor was visibly unraveling, her silver Lexus creeping past my house 4, sometimes 5 times a day, her face pressed against the tinted glass as she frantically snapped photographs, desperately searching for a single wilted leaf or pooled drop of water that she could twist into a health hazard, her desperation manifesting in a barrage of increasingly unhinged citations arriving daily in my mail, accusing my low-profile desert flowers of harboring mythical rodent infestations and violating imaginary noise ordinances during the silent process of photosynthesis. When her paper terrorism failed to break me, she pulled her most corrupt lever yet, dispatching a terrified, fresh-out-of-college city code enforcement officer who showed up trembling with an anonymous complaint about toxic chemical leaching, a young man who instantly turned pale and fled the moment I presented him with a certified environmental soil purity report, but not before Martha, who had spent 4 decades processing municipal records before retiring, identified the boy as Kevin, the deeply compromised son of the nervous board member Arthur. This wasn't just a petty neighborhood squabble anymore. This was a fully integrated, multi-generational syndicate of suburban racketeering, a reality that crystallized when Martha dragged me down to the basement archives of the Clark County Recorder's office, her frail fingers flying through microfiche and heavy binders until she slammed a yellowing document onto the desk that held the power to end the war instantly. We had unearthed an unamended clause from the original 1992 charter explicitly stating that the Homeowners Association was legally forbidden from levying any fine that exceeded the literal, verifiable out-of-pocket cost required to remedy a violation, meaning every single arbitrary, punitive fee Eleanor had extracted from the neighborhood over the past 6 years. The hundreds of dollars for a misplaced trash can, the extortionate late fees, the staggering administrative penalties, was not just a violation of bylaws. It was textbook, prosecutable financial fraud to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The final piece of the guillotine snapped into place when I tracked down the former board president, David Sterling. a man who had been ruthlessly hounded out of the neighborhood years ago when he started asking too many questions, who sat on the other end of a phone call in stunned silence before admitting he had kept a meticulously detailed, hidden ledger documenting every kickback, every fake contract, and every illegal maneuver Eleanor had executed to seize power. 5 years of devastating evidence he had been hoarding, just waiting for someone with the grit to actually use it. My garage, once a quiet sanctuary for tinkering and memories, was rapidly converted into a fully operational, military-grade command center, the walls plastered with complex flowcharts tracking the Vance family's shell companies, connecting Arthur's Eco Assessments, a firm that charged 15 grand to walk around the block twice, directly to the fraudulent violations used to fund it, while a brilliant forensic accountant named Julia Navarro from 3 streets over sat at my workbench, laughing in disbelief at how cleanly and arrogantly they had documented their own massive embezzlement scheme. The tension in the neighborhood had stretched so thin it was practically humming, an invisible wire of anticipation that finally snapped at 2 o'clock in the morning when my heavily upgraded, military-grade motion sensors silently alerted my phone to an intrusion, pulling me from a restless sleep to watch a live, high-definition infrared feed of pure, unfiltered madness unfolding in my front yard. There on the glowing screen was Eleanor Vance, stripped of her daytime veneer of untouchable grace, dressed in dark athleisure wear, ripping my beautiful Mojave asters from the soil with her bare hands, hurling the heavy agave plants against my garage door in a fit of feral, hyperventilating rage, systematically destroying the physical manifestation of her lost control, while my hidden cameras captured every single agonizing detail of her committing felony vandalism and destruction of evidence. In what was rapidly becoming a federal investigation, I didn't confront her in the dark. I simply poured a cup of coffee and watched her shatter her own life, waiting until dawn to call Detective Marcus Thorne at the local precinct, a seasoned investigator whose eyes went wide when he viewed the crisp, undeniable footage of the neighborhood's pristine dictator acting like a deranged criminal, immediately escalating the situation from a local disturbance to an active criminal harassment case intrinsically tied to the federal housing discrimination complaints I had already ceded. As the sun rose over the massacre of my father's memorial, I wasn't allowed to sink into despair because the neighborhood simply wouldn't let me. With Sophia arriving unprompted with a truckload of replacement flora, Mateo mobilizing his entire professional crew on his day off to rebuild the irrigation, and dozens of neighbors I had never even spoken to descending on my driveway with trowels, fresh soil, and a unified, burning desire to resurrect the gardens twice as large, a beautiful, collective middle finger to the darkness that had ruled them for so long. Eleanor's final, catastrophic mistake occurred when the local Action 8 news van pulled up to document the heartwarming community rebuild, a presence that caused her to snap completely, storming across the asphalt into the glare of the professional lighting rigs to scream wildly at the journalists about media conspiracies, ultimately launching into a vile, unfiltered, and deeply prejudiced tirade about how working-class people with their disgusting, recycled tires were fundamentally destroying the aristocratic purity of her neighborhood, a horrific meltdown broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of stunned viewers across Nevada. The special election held the following evening in the suffocatingly packed community center wasn't a meeting, it was an execution, the air thick with the electric charge of absolute, undeniable justice, with over 200 residents cramming into the room to watch Eleanor sit isolated and trembling at the head table, completely abandoned by Arthur and Brenda, who had vanished, presumably desperately trying to secure immunity deals with the authorities. When I stepped up to the microphone, I didn't yell or gloat. I calmly and methodically projected the forensic evidence compiled by Julia Navarro onto the massive screen, walking the silent, spellbound crowd through the intricate web of fake vendors, the $250,000 in illegally harvested fines, and the heartbreaking, racially targeted discrimination that had funded the Vance family's lavish lifestyle, capping the presentation with the undeniable proof that every single rule she had enforced over the last half-decade was entirely illegitimate. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sharp, authoritative click of handcuffs as Special Agent Rachel Brooks of the FBI, who had been quietly observing from the back row, stepped forward to place the neighborhood's supreme ruler under federal arrest for wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and egregious violations of the Fair Housing Act, a moment of profound, cinematic karma that sent an erupting, deafening wave of cheers, tears, and applause shaking through the very foundation of the building. As Eleanor was perp-walked past my freshly blooming, brilliantly illuminated tire gardens, her face twisted in a mask of absolute defeat. The elderly, indomitable Martha Higgins was unanimously voted in as the new president of the association, instantly passing resolutions to fully audit the finances, refund every single illegal fine with the accrued interest, and permanently enshrine the right to creative, sustainable landscaping into the unalterable core of the community charter. 6 months later, the oppressive, sterile atmosphere of Cypress Point Reserve had completely evaporated, replaced by a vibrant, deeply connected community where nearly 50 homes proudly displayed their own upcycled botanical masterpieces, creating a sprawling network of sustainable desert agriculture that drastically reduced our water usage and transformed strangers into family. A revolution that prompted my daughter to fly down from Portland, weeping openly as she stood amongst the glowing flowers, recognizing that I had channeled the agonizing grief of losing her mother into a legacy of undeniable light. The Vance empire had crumbled into dust, their assets seized to pay back the families they had tormented, while our victory triggered a cascade of new legislative protections across the entire state of Nevada, turning our little rebellion into a recognized case study for environmental justice and community resilience at UNLV, complete with a scholarship fund raised entirely from the ashes of the old, corrupt regime. Yet, as the desert sun sets on my thriving, peaceful sanctuary, my phone continues to buzz, this time with desperate messages from a community over in Henderson where a new tyrant is trying to forcefully bulldoze their organic vegetable gardens, prompting Martha and I to pack my truck with legal binders and fresh seedlings. Because once you realize the absolute fragility of corrupt power, you can never look away from a fight. It makes you wonder, when the systems designed to protect us are inevitably twisted by greed to control us, at what point does breaking the rules stop being an act of rebellion and start becoming the only moral obligation a decent person is left?
And we are at the end of the videos. I hope you had a great time watching it. If you had any feedback or suggestion for the future videos, drop them in the comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching and see you next time.